I thought my brother was finally respecting my career when he asked me to help him set up a small business entity for his real estate ventures. I thought the golden child was finally seeing my worth, finally recognizing the years of hard work I put into building my own life. But when federal agents kicked down the gates of his luxury estate with their weapons drawn, I realized I was never his business partner. I was his human shield. He had framed me to take the fall for a multi-million-dollar financial crime, and my own mother watched him do it, cheering him on as I was dragged away in handcuffs. My name is Zaria, and I am 32 years old. I work as a freelance certified public accountant, specifically dealing in forensic accounting. I untangle financial messes, track hidden assets, and fix the books for honest, hardworking small businesses in our community. I survived my family by keeping my distance, focusing entirely on my career and my independence. But one seemingly innocent signature, a favor for my own flesh and blood, pulled me right back into their toxic trap. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, underestimated and undervalued, and had to fight your way out of the darkness they pushed you into. Growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, my family was absolutely obsessed with keeping up appearances. To the outside world, the Washington family was a pillar of excellence. But inside our home, it was a constant battleground of blatant favoritism and emotional manipulation. DeAndre, my older brother, was the undisputed golden child. He was 35 years old, a flashy wealth manager who wore custom suits and drove cars that cost more than a college education. In my mother, Brenda's eyes, he could do absolutely no wrong. He was her retirement plan, her bragging right at church, and her absolute pride and joy. I, on the other hand, was the disappointment. My mother always called me the girl who counts other people's pennies. Last Sunday, I broke my own rule and agreed to attend DeAndre's annual summer barbecue. The Atlanta sun was beating down fiercely on his sprawling $3 million estate. The massive circular driveway looked like a luxury car dealership packed with Range Rovers, Mercedes, and heavily tinted sports cars. In the backyard, a live jazz band played softly near the edge of a massive infinity pool. DeAndre was holding court by the outdoor kitchen, holding a glass of expensive champagne, laughing loudly with a group of wealthy investors. His wife Keisha, a luxury real estate agent who was famous for selling nothing but a fake lifestyle, was busy live-streaming the entire event on her phone. She strutted around in a designer silk dress, shoving her camera in the faces of annoyed guests, making sure everyone on the internet knew exactly how rich they were. I was sitting quietly at a corner patio table, sipping a glass of sparkling water, wondering why I had even bothered to show up. I was wearing a simple tailored navy suit, completely out of place among the flashy resort wear and heavy gold jewelry surrounding me. My mother Brenda made sure I felt that isolation. She marched past my table, paused, and eyed my outfit from head to toe with absolute disgust. "You know, Zaria, you could at least try to look successful if you are going to eat your brother's expensive food." She scoffed loudly, ensuring the wealthy women at the next table could hear her. "DeAndre gave you a chance to be part of his circle today. Stop sitting in the corner looking like a depressed librarian. Try to network. Maybe someone here needs help filing their taxes." I simply smiled tight-lipped and took another sip of my water. I knew my brother's wealth made no mathematical sense. As an accountant, I knew the margins of his supposed investment firm did not match the lifestyle he was flaunting. But I kept my mouth shut. Then, without a single moment of warning, the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of the estate were blown wide open. A massive black armored tactical vehicle smashed right through the perfectly manicured hedges, tearing up the expensive landscaping. Men and women clad in heavy dark tactical gear swarmed the lawn from every direction. Federal agents. "Nobody move. Keep your hands exactly where we can see them. This is a federal raid." The booming voice came from a megaphone. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing. Women screamed in sheer terror. Someone bumped into a waiter, and a silver tray of expensive champagne glasses crashed against the stone patio, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. I stood up instantly, my heart pounding violently against my ribs, my forensic mind racing to process the chaos unfolding in front of me. Two agents carrying heavy tactical rifles rushed straight for DeAndre. A man in a dark windbreaker stepped forward, flashing a gold badge. Agent Sterling, Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Securities and Exchange Commission. DeAndre Washington, you are under federal investigation for wire fraud and massive money laundering operations. We have a signed warrant for your immediate arrest and the absolute seizure of this property and all associated assets. DeAndre dropped his champagne glass. It shattered by his expensive loafers. His arrogant, untouchable smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a pale, sickening look of sheer panic. He backed up against the outdoor grill, raising his hands, but the panic only lasted for a fleeting second. I watched his eyes dart frantically across the patio. I watched him calculate his survival. Then, his eyes locked directly onto me. Without a single moment of hesitation, without a shred of remorse, my brother raised his hand and pointed his finger straight at my chest. I have no idea what you are talking about, DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking, but echoing loudly across the dead, silent yard. I am just a consultant. I am just a financial advisor. That company, the Holding LLC you are looking for, belongs entirely to my sister. She is the managing owner. She handles all the banking and all the accounts. Ask her. Take her. The entire crowd of guests gasped in unison. Keisha, who had been trembling and crying real tears just a second ago, suddenly stood up completely straight. She crossed her arms over her chest, and a sickening, triumphant smirk spread across her perfectly contoured face. Before I could even process the magnitude of his betrayal, Agent Sterling turned his sharp gaze toward me. Two heavily armed officers closed the distance between us in seconds. They grabbed my arms forcefully, twisting them roughly behind my back. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs clicked loudly around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin. I stared at my brother in absolute, paralyzing shock. I tried to speak. I tried to scream that I only signed the incorporation paperwork last month because he begged me for a favor, claiming he needed a separate tax entity for a small property. But the words completely caught in my dry throat. I looked desperately toward my mother. Surely she would defend me. Surely she would tell the federal agents there was a massive mistake. But Brenda did not run to my side. She did not ask the armed officers to stop. Instead, she marched right up to me, her face twisted in raw, unfiltered rage. "Look at what you have done to this family," she screamed, pointing her manicured finger inches from my face. "You are always ruining things for your brother. He worked so hard to build his beautiful life to provide for us, and you bring the police to his house. You are a jealous, bitter disgrace to this family. You always have been. Take her away, officer." She probably messed up his taxes on purpose just to ruin his big day. The officers pulled me away, dragging me roughly across the manicured lawn. My sensible heels dug into the mud. I looked back over my shoulder one last time. Keisha was actually holding her phone up again, clearly recording my humiliating arrest, to post for her thousands of followers, building a narrative that I was the criminal black sheep of the family. DeAndre was already smoothing out the lapels of his custom jacket, playing the innocent, victimized businessman. I was being marched to a federal police cruiser in broad daylight, publicly sacrificed by my own blood, taking the fall for a massive financial crime I did not even know existed. The ride to the federal building in downtown Atlanta was a terrifying blur of flashing red and blue lights and sheer suffocating panic. They placed me in a small, freezing interrogation room. The walls were bare cinder block, the metal table bolted firmly to the floor. I sat there for 3 agonizing hours, shivering in my thin suit, my forensic accountant brain racing through every single document DeAndre had ever asked me to look at over the years. I tried to trace every signature, every favor, every time he used the word family to get me to comply. Finally, the heavy metal door clicked open, and Agent Sterling walked into the room. He did not look angry. He looked at me with a cold mixture of pity and sharp calculation. He was carrying a massive cardboard box. He reached in and pulled out a binder, dropping a 500-page bank ledger onto the metal table with a deafening heavy thud. It was a staggering, overwhelming pile of financial records, offshore wire transfers, and encrypted routing numbers. "I know you are a certified public accountant," Zaria, Agent Sterling said slowly, pulling out a metal chair and sitting directly across from me. "I know you specialize in forensics. That means you know how to track missing money better than anyone, and it also means I know you can recognize a fraudulent shell company when you see one. You signed the exact legal paperwork establishing yourself as the sole managing member of Apex Wealth Holdings, LLC. He slid the top document across the table. I looked down at the highlighted lines. My legal signature was sitting right there, right on the dotted line where DeAndre had pointed last month in his kitchen, rushing me to sign so he could close a small real estate deal. Your brother did not just evade a few local property taxes. Zaria. Agent Sterling continued, his voice dropping incredibly low, filling the silent room with a chilling reality. This shell company you legally signed for the company that bears your name and your social security number was used to systematically launder $15 million. And right now, according to the federal government, you are the only person on the hook for a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. I stared at the thick stack of papers resting on the cold metal table. The air in the interrogation room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating my lungs. But I did not cry. My mother always told me my lack of emotion made me unnatural, but in that sterile room, my cold logic was my only shield. I pulled the binder closer, ignoring Agent Sterling's piercing gaze. I am a certified public accountant. Numbers are my native language. I opened the first folder and my eyes rapidly scanned the columns, the dates, and the routing numbers. It took my trained mind less than 10 seconds to connect the dots. The sickening reality washed over me in an icy wave. I remembered the exact afternoon last month. DeAndre had shown up at my modest apartment completely unannounced, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and flashing his signature charismatic smile. He told me he was proud of my freelance work and wanted to help me level up. He brought in corporation papers claiming he was setting up a limited liability company for me entirely on his dime so I could finally launch a legitimate accounting firm. He pointed to the dotted lines, rushing me, telling me he had a tea time at the country club and needed to file the paperwork that afternoon. I trusted my brother. I signed the documents. Looking at the federal ledgers now, I saw exactly what I had signed. Apex Wealth Holdings, LLC was never meant to be my accounting firm. It was a massive washing machine for dirty money. The bank statements showed millions of dollars funneling in from various local accounts sitting in the LLC for exactly 48 hours, and then wire transferring out to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Every single transaction bore my electronic signature as the managing director. DeAndre had set me up as the perfect disposable fall guy. I closed the binder slowly and pushed it back across the table. I looked Agent Sterling dead in the eye. "I want a lawyer," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the panic he was waiting to see. "I will not say another word without legal representation." Sterling sighed, packing up the files. "You have a clean record and deep ties to the community, Zaria. The judge granted you release on your own recognizance pending arraignment, but the grand jury convenes in exactly 48 hours. You need to think carefully about who you are protecting. They are not protecting you." The heavy metal door opened, and I walked out of the federal building into the sweltering Atlanta evening. I did not go back to my apartment. I hailed a cab and gave the driver my mother's address. I needed answers. I needed to look my brother in the face and hear him explain how he could hand me over to the federal government just to save his own skin. When I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors of Brenda's pristine custom-built home, the atmosphere was entirely unsettling. There was no panic. There was no frantic rushing to find me a defense attorney. Instead, I walked into an ambush perfectly staged in the formal living room. DeAndre was sitting comfortably on the plush velvet sofa, his expensive tailored jacket draped over a chair. He was casually swirling a glass of aged bourbon, looking completely unbothered by the fact that the FBI had just raided his estate. Keisha was sitting next to him, her legs crossed, meticulously filing her acrylic nails as if it were a lazy Sunday afternoon. My mother, Brenda, was pacing in front of the massive stone fireplace, wringing her hands, but her eyes held no sympathy for me. They held irritation. "You set me up," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room. I stood in the doorway, staring at the family I shared blood with, realizing I did not know them at all. "You used my name to launder $15 million, DeAndre. You handed me to the feds on a silver platter." DeAndre took a slow sip of his bourbon and set the crystal glass on the coffee table. He did not look guilty. He looked annoyed. "Keep your voice down, Zarya," DeAndre said smoothly, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Let us look at this logically. Let us talk about the reality of the situation. The feds want a conviction. They do not care who they put behind bars as long as they get a headline." I stared at him in sheer disbelief. "You think I'm going to let you pin this on me?" DeAndre stood up, walking slowly toward me with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. "You are going to take the fall, Zarya. Think about it. You have no husband. You have no kids. Your freelance accounting gig is a complete dead end. You rent a tiny apartment. If I go down, this whole family loses its foundation. I pay for Mom's mortgage. I pay for Keisha's lifestyle. I am the pillar of this family. You are just existing." He stepped closer, lowering his voice into a sickeningly persuasive tone. "The federal prosecutor will offer a plea deal. You are a first-time offender. You take the plea, you do 3 years in a minimum security camp. It is practically a country club. When you get out, I will have $1 million in clean cash waiting for you. It is more money than you will ever make counting pennies for those broke businesses you work for. Be a team player for once in your life." My stomach violently churned. The absolute sociopathy in his eyes was terrifying. He was asking me to throw away my freedom, my pristine professional license, and my entire future, all so he could continue drinking bourbon and wearing custom suits. "I am not going to federal prison for your fraud," I spat, taking a step back from him. "I am going to walk into the federal prosecutor's office tomorrow morning, and I am going to map out exactly how you structured those offshore accounts. I am a forensic accountant, DeAndre. You really thought I could not trace the money back to you?" Before DeAndre could answer, my mother lunged across the room. Brenda grabbed my arm with shocking force, her long manicured nails digging violently into my bare flesh. I gasped, trying to pull away, but her grip was like a vice. "You ungrateful, selfish little girl!" Brenda screamed, her face contorted with absolute rage. Her eyes were wild, completely blinded by her obsession with her golden child. "Your brother provides everything for us. He bought me this beautiful house. He elevated the Washington name. What have you ever done for this family? You show up to our dinners looking like a peasant, judging us with your quiet little stares. You will do this for your family. You owe him your loyalty." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling the last remaining thread of my childhood completely snap. She was willing to sacrifice her daughter to a federal cage just to maintain the illusion of her son's perfection. She did not care about my life. I was entirely disposable to her. "Let go of me," I commanded, ripping my arm out of her painful grasp. I left deep red crescent marks on my own skin from the force. "You are all completely delusional. You think because you wear expensive clothes you are untouchable. I am leaving. I am hiring the most ruthless defense attorney in Atlanta, and I am handing over every single piece of financial evidence tying DeAndre to Apex Wealth. You will both be in handcuffs by Friday." I turned sharply on my heel, ready to walk out the front door and sever ties with them forever. But then Keisha laughed. It was a high-pitched, wicked sound that echoed loudly against the vaulted ceilings. She slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, dropping her nail file onto the cushion. She picked up her designer leather purse, reached her hand inside, and pulled out a stack of brightly colored plastic cards. She walked toward me, a triumphant, malicious smile stretched across her perfectly contoured face. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the stack of cards right onto the glass coffee table. They clattered loudly. I looked down. They were my bank cards, my debit card, my business credit cards, my savings account access cards. "Oh, Zarya," Keisha sneered, crossing her arms and looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Did you really forget what was in that stack of incorporation papers you signed last month? DeAndre did not just make you the owner of the LLC. He slipped in a financial power of attorney clause. You gave him joint access to everything you own." The air rushed out of my lungs. My forensic mind immediately flashed back to the documents, realizing the horrifying truth of her words. "DeAndre froze your accounts the second you were arrested," Keisha continued, her voice dripping with sheer venom. Every single penny you have saved, every business account you manage is completely locked. You have absolutely $0 to hire a lawyer. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now, let alone retain a defense attorney. DeAndre walked up behind his wife, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder while glaring at me with predatory confidence. "You are out of moves," little sister DeAndre whispered softly. "You have no money. You have no family backing you. And in 48 hours, the feds will indict you. Be smart. Sign the confession, take the 3 years, and maybe I will still give you that $1 million when you get out." They stood there, a unified wall of corruption and greed, completely convinced they had trapped me in a corner I could never escape. They thought they had stripped me of all my power. They thought freezing my bank accounts would break my spirit and force me to submit to their narrative. But they severely underestimated the girl who counts other people's pennies. I walked out of my mother's house and into the humid night air with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back and the dead plastic cards in my purse. I tried to hail a cab on the busy street corner, but when I swiped my debit card on the terminal, the screen blinked red with a blunt, declined message. The driver kicked me out immediately, leaving me standing alone on Peachtree Street. I walked 3 miles in the dark to my small apartment. My feet were blistered from my sensible heels, and my chest was tight with a rage so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my ribs. Keisha was right about one thing. DeAndre had moved incredibly fast. Every single account tied to my social security number was frozen solid by the federal investigation and his fraudulent power of attorney stunt. I was completely locked out of my own life. But DeAndre was an arrogant fool who fundamentally misunderstood how forensic accounting works. He thought money only existed in bank branches and leather wallets. He did not realize that I never leave a digital footprint unsecured. As soon as I locked my apartment door, I bypassed my frozen personal laptop and pulled an old encrypted tablet from a hidden floorboard under my bed. When Agent Sterling had slid that massive 500-page bank ledger across the interrogation table earlier today, I had not just been speed-reading the accusations. I had memorized the primary transaction hash identifiers. I booted up the tablet and accessed my secure offshore cloud server. Using a backdoor entry protocol I had built years ago for corporate auditing, I pinged the federal indictment records that were slowly being uploaded to the public domain network. It took me 3 grueling hours of brute force coding, typing furiously in the dark, but I finally bypassed the redactions. The full, unedited list of Apex Wealth Holdings investors flashed onto my glowing screen. I leaned in closely, expecting to see the names of nameless Wall Street hedge funds or naive tech billionaires. I expected to see greedy corporate investors who blindly gambled their massive trust funds on DeAndre and his flashy tailored suits. What I saw made my blood run entirely cold. The first name on the ledger was Mount Zion Baptist Church, our childhood church, the exact congregation where my mother sang in the choir every Sunday morning. The ledger showed a massive transfer of $2.5 million. It was the entirety of the community building fund meant for the new youth center. I scrolled down with trembling fingers, my breath catching in my throat. The next name was Thomas Jefferson, Pastor Thomas, the man who had baptized me when I was a child. DeAndre had drained his entire $400,000 retirement account. The list kept going, and every single name was a sharp knife to my chest. Mrs. Higgins, the 80-year-old widow who lived down the street from our childhood home, had lost her life savings of $60,000. Mr. Vance, the retired postal worker, had invested his entire pension. DeAndre did not go to Wall Street to steal his millions. He went straight to our neighborhood. He sat in our church pews, smiled at the elderly black men and women who had watched him grow up, and systematically drained every single penny they had saved for their final years. He preyed on their unwavering trust. He used his golden boy reputation to convince them that he was helping the community build generational wealth. And then he put my name on the holding company. When the federal government finally unsealed the indictments, the community would not just see DeAndre as a failed businessman. They would see Zaria Washington, the managing director of Apex Wealth, as the sinister architect of their financial ruin. He had set me up to bear the eternal hatred of our entire community. He wanted them to spit on my name. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in the dark, watching the sun rise over the Atlanta skyline, feeling a cold, calculating calmness wash over me. The initial fear of federal prison was entirely gone. It was replaced by a sharp clinical need to destroy him. At 8 in the morning, I walked straight into the lobby of DeAndre's luxury high-rise office building downtown. I bypassed the front security desk by slipping into the executive elevator right behind a group of distracted corporate executives. I marched down the glass-walled corridor of his wealth management firm, ignoring the protests of his receptionist, and kicked open the heavy oak door to his corner office. DeAndre was sitting comfortably behind his massive mahogany desk, sipping a green smoothie and laughing into his Bluetooth earpiece. When he saw me, his smile vanished. He tapped his earpiece, ending the call, and leaned back in his leather executive chair, crossing his arms defensively. "Security is getting incredibly lazy," he sneered, reaching a hand toward his desk phone. "I thought I told you to go cry in your cheap apartment, Zaria. Did you walk all the way here to beg for that $1 million I promised you?" I walked right up to his desk and slammed my hands flat against the polished wood, leaning over until I was inches from his face. "I saw the unredacted ledger, DeAndre," I said, my voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper that echoed in the quiet room. "I saw the names. Mount Zion Baptist, Pastor Thomas, Mrs. Higgins. You did not just run a corporate shell company. You robbed our own people. You stole the retirement funds of the women who baked cookies for us when we were kids. You stole the church youth fund." DeAndre did not flinch. He did not look ashamed. He did not look like a man whose horrific crimes had just been exposed. Instead, a slow, sickeningly amused smile spread across his handsome face. He picked up his expensive silver pen and twirled it casually between his fingers. "So what?" he chuckled, shaking his head as if I were a naive child complaining about a broken toy. "Business is business, Zaria. Do you think I got this corner office by playing nice? Those old fools wanted a quick return on their pathetic investments. They wanted to feel like they were part of the big leagues. I gave them a beautiful dream. If they were stupid enough to hand over their life savings to a guy in a nice suit without reading the fine print, then they deserve to lose it. That is capitalism, little sister. Only the strong survive." I stared at him, feeling absolutely nauseated. He was a complete sociopath. "You used them." I fired back, my knuckles turning white against the desk. "And then you used me. You put my name on the LLC because you knew this day would come. You knew the feds would track the missing money, and you wanted the community to blame me. You wanted Pastor Thomas to look at the federal paperwork and think the quiet accountant sister was the criminal mastermind." DeAndre leaned forward, dropping the silver pen onto the desk. His eyes turned incredibly dark and threatening. "I did what I had to do to protect the Empire, Zaria. You are collateral damage. Just accept it and take the plea deal." I stood up straight, adjusting the collar of my navy jacket. The trembling in my hands had completely stopped. "I am not taking the fall for your empire," I stated coldly and clearly looking down at him. "I am leaving this office right now, and I am going straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters. I am going to hand Agent Sterling the decrypted transaction logs, showing your direct IP address, initiating every single wire transfer from the church accounts into Apex Wealth. I am going to tell Pastor Thomas and the entire congregation exactly what you did to them. You are not going to win this, DeAndre. I will burn your luxurious life to the ground before I let you put me in a cage." I turned around, heading for the heavy oak door, completely ready to end his reign of terror. "Zaria." His voice stopped me dead in my tracks. It was not angry. It was dripping with unbearable confidence. I paused, my hand hovering over the brass doorknob. "You think you can walk into the FBI and tell them a story about me framing you?" DeAndre asked, letting out a soft, malicious laugh. "You really think Pastor Thomas will listen to a single word that comes out of your mouth today?" I turned back to look at him, confused. He was holding up his sleek smartphone, the screen glowing brightly in the dim office. "You are a little late for damage control, little sister." He smiled darkly, tapping the screen. "Go ahead. Check Instagram now." I snatched the phone from his hand and looked at the glowing screen. Keisha was live on Instagram to her 100,000 followers. She was sitting on her pristine white couch wearing no makeup, her hair tied back to look purposely exhausted and heartbroken. Real tears were streaming down her face. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "I cannot even believe I have to make this video," Keisha sobbed into the camera, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "But my husband and I believe in transparency. We believe in our community. Yesterday, the FBI raided our home because of my sister-in-law, Zaria. I watched in absolute horror as Keisha spun a web of lies so intricate and evil that it took my breath away. She told her followers that DeAndre had hired me out of pity, trying to help his struggling, bitter younger sister build an accounting career. She claimed I had abused that trust. She looked directly into the lens and said I had secretly hacked into DeAndre's firm, diverted community investments, and stolen the church building fund to buy designer bags and fund a secret lavish lifestyle. "She stole from Pastor Thomas," Keisha cried, her voice cracking perfectly. "She stole from the elderly. DeAndre is absolutely devastated. He trusted his sister and she framed him to cover her tracks. Please pray for our family." I shoved the phone back onto his mahogany desk. DeAndre was leaning back in his leather chair, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He had effectively weaponized social media to assassinate my character before I even had a chance to speak. He knew the community would blindly believe a crying, beautiful woman over a quiet, introverted accountant. "You are a monster," I whispered, the weight of his betrayal crushing the last bit of air from my lungs. "I am a survivor," DeAndre corrected smoothly, turning his chair back toward his computer monitors. "Get out of my office, Zaria, and good luck finding anyone in Atlanta who will even look you in the eye today." I turned and practically ran out of his office, pushing past the receptionist and sprinting to the elevator. As the doors closed, my own phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. It was not just one notification, it was a relentless, continuous buzzing. I pulled it out and saw hundreds of text messages, direct messages, and missed calls flooding my screen. The congregation had seen the video. The smear campaign was working instantly. The messages were vicious. Church members who had known me since I was a little girl in Sunday school were calling me a thief, a demon, and a disgrace to the Black community. One message from a deacon read that I better watch my back if I ever stepped foot in their neighborhood again. Death threats from anonymous accounts poured in, promising to make me pay for stealing from the elderly. Then the screen flashed with an incoming call. It was Pastor Thomas. I answered it immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone to my ear. "Pastor Thomas, please, you have to listen to me," I begged, desperate to get the truth out. "DeAndre is lying. He set up the shell company. I can prove it with the transaction logs." "Do not speak to me with that deceitful tongue, Zaria." Pastor Thomas interrupted, his voice booming with a righteous, furious thunder I had never heard from him before. "Your mother warned me about your jealous heart years ago, but I refused to believe a child of God could be so wicked. You stole the youth center from our children. You stole my retirement. You have brought a curse upon your own family." "Pastor, I did not take a single penny." I pleaded, tears stinging my eyes. "He is using my name as a shield." "You are permanently banned from Mount Zion Baptist Church," Pastor Thomas stated coldly, ignoring my cries completely. "If you ever step foot on our grounds, I will have you arrested for trespassing. May God have mercy on your dark soul, Zaria." He hung up the phone. The line went dead. I stood alone in the elevator, completely isolated from the only community I had ever known. I walked back to my apartment building in a daze, the harsh morning sun beating down on my shoulders. When I turned the corner onto my street, I stopped dead in my tracks. My mother, Brenda, was standing on the sidewalk in front of my building. Next to her were 3 large black trash bags and a cardboard box. I slowly approached her, my heart sinking into my stomach. Brenda looked at me with a coldness that chilled me to the bone. She did not see her daughter standing in front of her. She saw the villain who was trying to ruin her golden child. "Mom, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I spoke to your landlord," Brenda said, her tone sharp and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. Since I co-signed your lease years ago, I legally terminated it this morning. He gave me 30 minutes to clear out whatever I could. The rest is locked inside. You are evicted. You cannot do this to me, I said, stepping forward. DeAndre froze my accounts. I have nowhere to go. I have no money. You should have thought about that before you stole from the church and framed your brother. Brenda spat, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small framed photograph. It was a picture of the two of us from my college graduation. She threw it onto the concrete sidewalk. The glass shattered instantly, the sound echoing loudly down the quiet street. You are no longer my daughter, Brenda announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. I have no daughter. I only have a son. If you ever contact me again, I will file a restraining order. Pick up your garbage and get out of my sight. She turned her back on me, got into her luxury sedan, and drove away without looking back once. She left me standing on the sidewalk, staring at my broken graduation picture surrounded by trash bags holding the meager remains of my entire life. I gathered my bags and dragged them 3 blocks down the street to where my 10-year-old sedan was parked. It was the only asset I owned outright that DeAndre could not freeze. I threw the bags into the trunk, slammed it shut, and climbed into the driver's seat. The inside of the car was stiflingly hot, but I did not turn on the engine. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. They had taken my money. They had taken my reputation. They had turned my entire community against me. They had stripped away my mother and thrown me onto the street like discarded garbage. They expected me to break. They expected me to sit in this sweltering car, cry my eyes out, and eventually crawl back to DeAndre to sign that fake confession just to survive. But I refused to cry. The tears simply would not come. Instead, an absolute freezing calm washed over my entire body. The hurt-betrayed sister died in that car. The forensic certified public accountant took the wheel. DeAndre thought he was a mastermind because he knew how to manipulate people's emotions. But numbers do not have emotions. Numbers do not care about fake tears on Instagram. Numbers do not care about Brenda's blind favoritism. Numbers only tell the absolute, undeniable truth. And I was going to use those numbers to dismantle their luxurious, fraudulent lives penny by penny. I was going to rip the foundation right out from under them. I reached for the ignition to start the car, my mind already forming a tactical plan to bypass the frozen accounts and access my secure servers. Suddenly, a sharp, loud tap on the driver's side window made me jump. I turned my head quickly. A man wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes was standing right outside my car door. He was looking around nervously, checking the street behind him to make sure no one was watching. He tapped the glass again, urgently motioning for me to roll down the window. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock button, but my instincts told me this was not someone from the church coming to harass me. This man looked terrified. I slowly rolled down the window just an inch. Without saying a single word, the man shoved a thick manila envelope through the narrow crack. It landed heavily on my passenger seat. Before I could even ask who he was, he turned and sprinted down the alleyway, disappearing completely into the shadows of the city blocks. I stared at the envelope for a long moment. My heart began to pound, a steady rhythmic beat against my ribs. I reached over and picked it up. It was heavy. I tore open the top flap and dumped the contents onto the passenger seat. A single black USB flash drive fell out along with a folded piece of white paper. I unfolded the paper carefully. There was no greeting. There was only a short, hastily scrawled message written in black ink. It read, "I was DeAndre's executive assistant until he fired me yesterday to cover his tracks. He thinks he destroyed all the routing data. He was wrong. Check Keisha's real estate listings." I stared at the note, the words burning themselves into my mind. Check Keisha's real estate listings. The puzzle pieces suddenly started rapidly snapping together in my brain. Keisha's endless parade of multi-million-dollar home sales. Her sudden rise to the top of the Atlanta real estate market. The missing millions from the church. A cold, dangerous smile slowly crept across my face. DeAndre had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to bury them all. I drove to a rundown motel on the outskirts of Atlanta. I paid for 2 nights in cash using a small emergency stash I kept hidden inside my car's glove compartment. The room smelled faintly of stale smoke and cheap bleach, but it was highly secure. I locked the heavy deadbolt, pulled the faded blackout curtains tightly shut, and set up my encrypted tablet on the scratched laminate desk. My hands were perfectly steady now. The initial shock of my mother's betrayal had entirely worn off, leaving behind a cold, clinical determination. I plugged the black USB drive into the port. The screen immediately flashed bright red, prompting a high-level biometric lock and a 24-character alphanumeric passcode. DeAndre thought he was incredibly smart, hiring expensive corporate tech consultants to build his digital security walls, but he forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who taught him how to secure his very first private server years ago. I knew exactly how his mind worked, and I knew his foundational coding architecture. I did not need his password to get inside. I bypassed the user interface entirely and ran a complex script designed to attack the back-end directory structure. For 2 grueling hours, the screen scrolled furiously with endless lines of code as my automated program chipped away at the heavy encryption block by block. The motel room was dead silent except for the rapid clicking of my keyboard. Finally, the red warning screen dissolved into a stark white interface. The drive was wide open. I pulled up the primary storage folders and literally gasped aloud. DeAndre really thought he had wiped these servers completely clean before the federal agents raided his massive estate. But his former assistant had brilliantly created a hidden mirror drive capturing every single financial transaction in real time before the deletion protocol finished. The raw financial data was absolutely staggering to look at. I saw the highly encrypted blockchain ledgers tracing the exact mathematical path of the stolen community funds. He had taken the hard-earned cash from Pastor Thomas, and the congregation converted it into unregulated cryptocurrency, bounced it through a dozen decentralized digital exchanges to thoroughly wash the origin trail, and then funneled it right back into traditional offshore banking accounts located in the Cayman Islands. But the offshore accounts were only half of the story. I opened a secondary folder labeled Domestic Real Estate Acquisitions and immediately remembered the handwritten note from the terrified assistant. Check Keisha's real estate listings. I pulled up a secondary internet browser and opened Keisha's professional Instagram page, carefully comparing her boasted sales records with the raw financial logs sitting on the decrypted USB drive. Keisha loved to brag about her rapid rise to the top of the Atlanta luxury real estate market. She posted edited videos handing over keys to multi-million-dollar mansions, claiming she represented the most exclusive buyers in Georgia. She wore designer clothes, telling young black women to hustle harder if they wanted her level of success. I cross-referenced the exact property addresses from her flashy social media posts with the transaction logs on my screen. The horrifying truth hit me with the destructive force of a runaway freight train. Keisha was not a successful real estate agent at all. She was an absolute complete fraud. Every luxury mansion she sold over the past 2 years was purchased by a network of ghost corporations. And those exact ghost corporations were funded directly by Apex Wealth Holdings. DeAndre was taking the money he stole from Pastor Thomas, the church youth fund, and elderly neighbors using it to buy real estate properties through his wife. Keisha would broker the fake deal, collecting a 6-figure commission, effectively washing the stolen money into perfectly legal income. DeAndre would then use those luxury properties as collateral to take out legitimate bank loans, pulling even more clean cash out of the fake assets. It was a closed-loop money laundering syndicate functioning right under the watchful nose of the federal government. They were living in a house of cards built on the backs of hardworking black families who trusted them. Keisha was not just a clueless wife enjoying the lavish spoils of her husband's white-collar crimes. She was an active, malicious co-conspirator. She knew exactly where every penny of that money came from. That was exactly why she was so desperate to frame me on her live broadcast. If I went down, I would take the fall for the LLC, and her fake real estate empire would remain completely untouched. I sat back in the creaky motel chair, the bright glow of the tablet reflecting sharply in my eyes. The sheer massive scale of their unchecked greed was breathtaking. I had enough hard, undeniable evidence sitting right in front of me on this small plastic desk to walk straight into the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters and completely exonerate myself. I could easily hand Agent Sterling the decrypted USB drive, show him the complex blockchain ledgers, mapping out the fraud, and confidently walk away a totally free woman. But as I stared intensely at the long list of names of the victims on the ledger, the familiar faces of my own betrayed community, I knew deeply that simply clearing my own name was absolutely not enough. Not. If I just handed over the drive right now, DeAndre would immediately hire a massive team of ruthless, expensive defense attorneys. He would aggressively tie the federal case up in endless court litigation for years, claiming the digital evidence was tampered with or illegally obtained. Meanwhile, he would quietly liquidate the offshore accounts and the fraudulent real estate assets, completely disappearing with the stolen money long before a federal judge ever handed down a final guilty verdict. Pastor Thomas, Mrs. Higgins, and the Church Youth Fund would never see a single dime of their precious life savings ever again. My mother, Brenda, would stubbornly continue to view him as a tragically misunderstood victim of a corrupt legal system, while viewing me as the ultimate traitor. No, I did not just need to legally prove my absolute innocence. I fiercely needed to trap them legally, financially, and incredibly publicly, so they could absolutely never touch that stolen money again. I needed to firmly secure the community funds and lock my brother out permanently. I needed to meticulously construct an airtight, invisible snare that would violently snap shut before they even realized they had foolishly stepped in it. I am a forensic certified public accountant. I know exactly how to legally dismantle a fraudulent financial structure from the inside out. I opened my complex coding terminal and began writing a highly specialized backdoor access protocol. If I could somehow manage to get my hands directly on DeAndre's actual physical laptop, the specific device he personally used to authenticate the massive wire transfers, I could silently mirror his encrypted drive and forcefully hijack the final destination routing numbers. I could literally steal the stolen money right back from him. My cheap burner phone loudly buzzed against the laminate desk, breaking my intense concentration. I purchased the phone at a gas station exactly an hour ago. Only one single person in the entire world currently had the new number. I slowly picked it up and pressed the green answer button without saying a single word. DeAndre's arrogant voice crackled through the cheap plastic speaker. "Hello, Zaria. I hear our loving mother kicked you to the curb this morning. It is a tough, cold world out there when you have nothing and nobody to protect you." He let out an incredibly dark, condescending chuckle that made my skin crawl. "Listen carefully, because I am feeling generous today. I am officially offering you a final lifeline out of this massive mess. Meet me at my corporate lawyer's office downtown tomorrow morning at exactly 10 sharp. You will sign a full legal confession taking sole complete responsibility for the illegal actions of Apex Wealth Holdings. In exchange, I will personally hand you a duffel bag filled with exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash. You can get on a bus immediately, leave the state, and comfortably start over somewhere quiet where nobody knows your face. Or you can refuse my generous offer and I will let the federal agents hunt you down like an animal while you slowly starve on the city streets. Choose wisely, little sister." I sat perfectly still listening to his threatening words. He truly believed he had broken me. He thought I was just a weak accountant desperate for his scraps. I stared at the brightly glowing blockchain ledgers displayed on my screen, meticulously mapping out the final brilliant steps of my ultimate financial revenge. The $50,000 was just a pathetic bribe to secure his getaway. But meeting him at the lawyer's office was the exact physical proximity I desperately needed to execute my trap. "I will be there," I said coldly, and hung up the phone. The next morning, I woke up early in the stale motel room and began meticulously preparing for the most important performance of my entire life. I purposely did not shower. I wore the exact same wrinkled navy suit from the day of the federal raid. I pulled my hair back into a messy, uneven knot and rubbed a small amount of dark eyeshadow under my eyes to simulate severe sleep deprivation and absolute despair. I needed to look entirely broken. I needed DeAndre to look at me and see a desperate, terrified woman who had completely given up the fight. I tucked a small black USB Bluetooth cloning dongle into the deep pocket of my trousers. The device was no larger than a standard piece of chewing gum. I had programmed it overnight to automatically execute a rapid data mirror protocol, the exact second it was plugged into a foreign hard drive. I left the motel and took a crowded city bus downtown. I arrived at the towering glass skyscraper in downtown Atlanta at exactly 9:55. The prestigious law offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the entire 40th floor, representing the most ruthless corporate defense attorneys in Georgia. I walked out of the polished steel elevator, keeping my shoulders severely slumped and my eyes cast down toward the expensive marble floors. The receptionist did not even offer me a polite smile. She simply buzzed me through a heavy oak door and pointed me toward a large glass-walled conference room at the end of the long corridor. When I pushed open the heavy glass door, the suffocating tension in the room hit me instantly. My mother Brenda was sitting stiffly at the far end of the massive mahogany conference table, holding a cup of gourmet black coffee perfectly. She wore a tailored emerald dress, looking like she was attending a country club luncheon rather than a legal surrender. She glanced at my wrinkled clothes and deeply shadowed eyes with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. She actually scoffed loudly, turning her face away from me as if simply looking at my disheveled state was a personal insult to her pristine reputation. Keisha was sitting next to her, aggressively tapping away on her phone, likely blocking more angry church members from her social media pages. When she saw me walk in, she let out a sharp, malicious laugh. "Look what the stray cat dragged in," she sneered, leaning back in her plush leather chair. "I guess reality finally set in, did it not, Zaria? You look absolutely pathetic. You should be down on your knees thanking your brother for even throwing you this tiny scrap of mercy today." I did not respond. I simply pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down silently, maintaining my carefully crafted facade of total defeat. DeAndre was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, arguing heatedly in hushed tones with a tall older man wearing an expensive tailored silver suit. The lawyer shook his head firmly, pointing a finger at DeAndre before aggressively pulling him out of the conference room and into the adjacent private hallway. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, muffling their intense argument. DeAndre had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. In his rush to assert dominance over his highly paid attorney, he had carelessly slammed his silver laptop directly onto the edge of the mahogany conference table, right across from where I was sitting quietly. The screen was still glowing brightly, entirely unlocked. I knew I only had a few precious seconds right now. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribcage, but I forced my hands to remain perfectly still. I let out a loud, pathetic-sounding sob, covering my face with my trembling hands. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Mom, I feel incredibly dizzy. I think I am going to pass out. Could you please just get me a glass of cold water from the credenza?" Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh of extreme irritation, rolling her eyes. She slammed her coffee cup down onto the mahogany table, glaring at me with absolute contempt completely. "You are always so incredibly dramatic, Zaria," she snapped angrily, pushing her chair back and standing up. "Stop acting like a child and pull yourself together. We are trying to save this family, and you are whining about water." She turned her back to me and angrily marched toward the marble credenza at the far end of the long conference room to pour a glass of water from the silver pitcher. Keisha was entirely distracted, furiously typing out a new angry comment immediately. She was completely ignoring my fake breakdown. The second Brenda's back was fully turned, I acted. I moved with the lightning speed of a trained forensic auditor. I reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out the tiny black Bluetooth dongle. I lunged slightly across the wide table, grabbing DeAndre's open laptop. I swiftly jammed the tiny device deep into the side USB port. The small black dongle sat perfectly flush against the silver casing, rendering it almost completely invisible unless you were looking directly for it. I instantly saw the automated script trigger on the screen, briefly flashing a tiny gray downloading icon. It disappeared entirely into the background operating system within seconds, absolutely. I smoothly slid the laptop back to its exact original position and collapsed back into my leather chair, burying my face in my hands, just as Brenda turned around and aggressively slammed a crystal glass of water onto the table in front of me. "Drink it and stop crying," she commanded coldly. "You are embarrassing yourself." I picked up the glass with intentionally shaking hands and took a slow sip. The heavy glass door swung open and DeAndre confidently strutted back into the conference room, looking extremely arrogant. His lawyer followed closely behind, carrying a thick stack of documents. DeAndre walked over to the table, completely ignoring his laptop, and sat down heavily in the head chair. He slid the thick stack of papers across the polished wood directly toward me. He also tossed a thick brown paper envelope onto the table. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud. "There is your 50,000 in untraceable cash," DeAndre stated, leaning back and crossing his arms with a sickeningly triumphant smile. "And right there is your full legal confession ready to sign. It clearly states that you acted entirely alone without my knowledge or consent when you created Apex. It states that you orchestrated the wire transfers and aggressively hid the stolen funds. Sign the last page and you can take the cash and walk right out of that door." I looked down at the documents. I slowly picked up the expensive black ink pen resting next to the papers. My hand trembled perfectly. I looked up at DeAndre, letting a single fake tear slowly roll down my cheek. "I am so sorry, DeAndre," I whispered weakly, feeling defeated. "I will do whatever you want, you." I flipped to the final signature page, pressing the tip of the pen. But I did not sign my actual legal name. In the complex world of forensic accounting and federal tax law, the absolute exact structure of a legal signature is incredibly critical. Every time I sign a binding federal tax document or a legitimate corporate contract, I use my full legal name, Zaria Elise Washington, with a very specific continuous looping cursive stroke. The federal government uses this exact biometric signature profile to authenticate my legal identity. Right now, on this fraudulent confession, I simply wrote Z Washington using a rigid block print style I had never once used professionally. It was a classic certified public accountant trick. A completely mismatched signature style executed under extreme duress easily invalidates the document in a federal court. To a jury, it proves coercion. To the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it proves the document is entirely void. I capped the pen and pushed the signed papers back across the table. DeAndre snatched them up, his eyes gleaming with absolute malicious victory. He did not bother to check the signature structure. He just saw the ink and assumed he finally won. "Good girl," DeAndre said, standing up. "Take your money and get out. If I ever see your face again, I will let the feds know where you are hiding." I grabbed the heavy envelope, stuffing it into my purse. I stood up and quickly walked out of the conference room. I did not look at Keisha or Brenda. I walked down the hallway and entered the elevator. The second the doors closed, my phone pinged. "Data mirror protocol complete. Target drive successfully cloned." I opened his synced calendar application. I stopped breathing as I read the strictly confidential entry. "Electronic flight booked for Saturday night. A one-way private charter. Destination Cayman Islands." I stared at the brightly glowing screen of my phone as the crowded city bus rattled down Peachtree Street. The sheer audacity of his escape plan sent a sharp jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. DeAndre was not just planning to beat the federal charges in court. He was orchestrating a massive permanent disappearance. He and Keisha were going to take the $15 million in stolen community funds, board a private luxury jet on Saturday night, and vanish completely into a tropical jurisdiction that heavily shielded corporate criminals from United States extradition laws. He intended to leave me sitting in a cold federal prison cell while he sipped expensive rum on a pristine white beach. I hurried back to my dimly lit motel room, firmly locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. I immediately booted up my encrypted tablet and established a secure wireless connection with the tiny Bluetooth cloning dongle still successfully attached to his silver laptop in that downtown law office. The data transfer had finished flawlessly, capturing his entire digital existence. I now had absolute total unrestricted access to every single file, email, and hidden folder DeAndre ever created. I opened the digital itinerary for the private charter flight, carefully checking the official passenger manifest. There were only two names explicitly listed: DeAndre Washington and Keisha Washington. I scrolled down, searching for a third ticket. I meticulously checked the cargo logs, the ground transportation arrangements, and the offshore luxury villa rental agreement, hoping to find a guest suite reserved for our mother. Nothing. My mother Brenda was absolutely nowhere to be found in any of his meticulous escape plans. The golden child was entirely abandoning his fiercely loyal creator, leaving her behind to face the devastating fallout of his massive financial crimes. My forensic instincts immediately flared up, burning with intense suspicion. DeAndre always used people as human shields, extracting every ounce of value. If he was leaving her behind, it meant she was no longer useful to him financially or socially. In the world of forensic accounting, we call this a burned asset. I needed to know exactly how he burned her. I needed to see the paper trail that led to her eventual destruction. If he was completely abandoning Brenda, he must have already extracted every single ounce of financial value from her existence. I aggressively pivoted my search away from the offshore routing numbers and dug deep into a heavily encrypted folder labeled Domestic Liabilities. It took me 20 grueling minutes of rapid coding to bypass the secondary firewall guarding this specific directory. When the folder finally cracked open, my eyes widened in absolute sheer horror. Sitting right at the top of the directory was a high-resolution scanned copy of a commercial bank document. It was a massive second mortgage agreement, legally binding the deed to our childhood home. The beautiful, sprawling brick house that my late father had worked 50 grueling hours a week to completely pay off decades ago. The house Brenda proudly bragged about at every single church function as her ultimate symbol of upper-middle-class stability. According to the authenticated digital paperwork, DeAndre had secretly leveraged the entire equity of the family estate, taking out a massive $3 million high-interest loan against the property. I frantically cross-referenced the dates on the mortgage agreement with his cryptocurrency trading logs. The sickening truth painted a horrifyingly clear picture displaying his absolute financial incompetence. 6 months ago, DeAndre made a remarkably stupid, highly leveraged gamble on an unregulated offshore crypto exchange. He lost millions in a matter of minutes. Desperate to cover his massive margin calls before his wealthy investors noticed the missing capital, he forged Brenda's signature on the second mortgage application. He literally stole the roof right over her head to briefly plug a massive hole in his sinking financial ship. And the absolute worst part was the incredibly aggressive repayment terms he agreed to. The loan was severely delinquent. A final notice of default was issued just yesterday. The commercial bank was officially initiating aggressive foreclosure proceedings. By next Monday morning, while DeAndre and Keisha were safely sunbathing in the Cayman Islands, heavily armed county sheriffs would arrive at Brenda's pristine brick house to physically throw her belongings onto the street. She would be completely homeless, destitute, and buried under $3 million of fraudulent, toxic debt. He had destroyed her life entirely, and she had absolutely no idea. She was sitting in her lavish living room sipping tea while a ticking financial time bomb was strapped directly to her chest. As a certified public accountant, I have seen families destroyed by bad investments, but this was intentional financial murder. He deliberately selected his own mother as the sacrificial lamb to protect his fragile ego and his fake wealth. The audacity was truly staggering, even for a narcissist like DeAndre. He actually thought he could outsmart the banking system, the federal government, and me all at the same time. I sat back in the cheap motel chair, feeling a strange, heavy silence settle over the room. For a brief, fleeting second, the deeply ingrained childhood instinct to protect my mother desperately clawed at my chest. Despite her cruel favoritism, despite the relentless psychological abuse, she was still the woman who raised me. I reached for my burner phone, my thumb instinctively hovering over the keypad. I could easily call her right now. I could warn her about the forged mortgage. I could tell her to immediately pack her bags, hire a ruthless real estate attorney, and fight the bank before the foreclosure became final. But before I could dial her number, a bright notification flashed across my screen. Keisha was broadcasting live on Instagram again. I tapped the notification, pulling up the live video feed. Keisha was sitting at a fancy outdoor cafe in Buckhead, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and sipping a bright pink cocktail. And sitting right next to her, looking incredibly smug and perfectly styled, was my mother, Brenda. I watched the screen in cold silence. Keisha turned the camera toward Brenda, smiling brightly. "Tell them, Brenda," Keisha cooed encouragingly. "Tell everyone how strong our family is right now." Brenda leaned directly into the camera frame, adjusting her expensive silk scarf. "We are doing wonderfully," Brenda announced, her voice dripping with absolute arrogant pride. "The truth always comes to the light. My son DeAndre is a brilliant man of God who built a beautiful empire. We are so incredibly blessed that the authorities are finally focusing their investigation on the real criminal who orchestrated this terrible misunderstanding. It breaks a mother's heart to see a jealous daughter betray her own blood, but Zarya always possessed a dark, wicked spirit. We have completely cut that toxic energy out of our lives. DeAndre is taking care of everything. He always protects his family." She smiled brilliantly for the thousands of community members watching the live feed, completely oblivious to the fact that her perfect son had just stolen her entire future. She was actively performing for the very people whose retirement funds funded Keisha's designer sunglasses. My thumb slowly moved away from the keypad. I watched my mother publicly, gleefully throw me to the federal wolves just to desperately protect the pristine image of the very man who was currently robbing her blind. She did not love me. She only loved the grand illusion of her golden child. The last remaining shred of my daughterly guilt completely evaporated into the cold, stale air of the motel room, leaving behind nothing but pure, hardened steel. She made her absolute choice yesterday at the barbecue when she watched them put me in handcuffs. I was completely done trying to save people who actively conspired to destroy me. I closed the Instagram application and firmly set the burner phone face down on the scratched laminate desk. "Let the wolves eat her," I whispered into the empty room. I meticulously organized the massive trove of decrypted data. I exported the blockchain ledgers, the fake real estate transactions, the forged second mortgage, the offshore routing numbers, and the private Cayman Islands flight itinerary onto a clean encrypted flash drive. I packed my small bag, changed into a fresh white blouse and a sharp black blazer, and walked out of the motel room with absolute crystal clear purpose. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address for the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in downtown Atlanta. I did not walk into the building as a terrified suspect. I walked through the heavy glass doors with the powerful, commanding stride of a forensic expert who held the absolute, undeniable truth in her hands. I bypassed the main reception desk and demanded to speak directly with Agent Sterling. When they escorted me into the familiar, sterile interrogation room, Sterling looked incredibly surprised to see me completely composed. He sat down across from me, folding his hands on the metal table, clearly expecting me to beg for a plea deal. Instead, I reached into my blazer pocket and slid the small black flash drive across the cold metal table. It stopped directly in front of him. Sterling looked down at the drive, and then back up at me, his brow heavily furrowed in confusion. "What is this, Zarya?" he asked suspiciously. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, looking him dead in the eye with absolute terrifying confidence. "That is $15 million of stolen community funds, heavily mapped, tracked, and fully authenticated," I stated coldly. "That is the entire fraudulent real estate portfolio your agency missed. And that is a confirmed flight itinerary showing your primary suspect leaving United States jurisdiction on Saturday night." Sterling stared at me, completely stunned by the sheer magnitude of the evidence I just casually dropped onto his desk. He reached for the drive, but I slammed my hand down flat over it, trapping it against the table. "I do not just want absolute legal immunity, Agent Sterling," I said, my voice low, sharp, and completely uncompromising. "I want to personally control the trap. I want full authorization to actively reroute those offshore wire transfers before they clear the final blockchain verification protocol. I want to build the digital cage he steps into on Saturday night, and I want to be the one who locks the door." Agent Sterling stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He looked down at the small black flash drive resting under my palm, and then back up at my face, realizing I was entirely serious. He did not see a scared victim anymore. He saw a highly trained financial weapon. Sterling slowly nodded and picked up his desk phone. Within 10 minutes, I was escorted deep into the secure basement levels of the federal building, into a highly classified cybercrimes war room. The room was packed with IRS, criminal investigators, SEC compliance officers, and FBI digital forensics experts. I stood at the head of a massive digital smartboard and began systematically dissecting my brother's entire fraudulent empire piece by piece. I showed them exactly how DeAndre forged my signature on the initial Apex Wealth Holdings LLC documents. I did not just tell them it was fake. I mathematically proved it. I pulled the exact IP address log from the electronic signature timestamp, revealing that the document was signed using the private wireless network at DeAndre's exclusive golf country club, while my own cellular location data proved I was sitting in my apartment 3 miles away. I showed them the keystroke velocity metrics, proving the person who typed my name had a completely different typing cadence than my established federal profile. The room of seasoned federal agents watched in absolute stunned silence as I effortlessly unraveled a $15 million money laundering syndicate in less than 2 hours. Next, I mapped out Keisha's fake real estate empire. I handed the IRS agents the specific parcel numbers and the Ghost Corporation tax identification numbers. They immediately began drafting massive asset seizure warrants for every single property Keisha had ever falsely claimed to sell. But the most critical part of the operation was the wire transfer. My mirroring software alerted us that DeAndre had officially initiated the massive $15 million transfer to his offshore Cayman Islands account on Thursday evening. International wire transfers of that massive magnitude require a strict 48-hour clearing window to bypass international banking regulations and homeland security flags. DeAndre meticulously timed the transaction to officially clear and settle at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday night. He wanted the money fully secured in a non-extradition jurisdiction while he was standing on stage soaking up the applause of the very people he was robbing. He planned to leave the gala, go straight to the private airstrip, and disappear into the night sky before the banks reopened on Monday morning. I worked side by side with the top federal cyber agents to execute a highly complex digital spoofing maneuver. If we simply froze the account prematurely, DeAndre's automated security systems would instantly alert him to the federal interference. He would panic, destroy his secondary physical evidence, and immediately flee the country before we could secure the remaining domestic assets. We needed him to feel completely victorious right up until the final fatal second. So we built a digital phantom. We aggressively intercepted the routing protocol and secretly redirected the actual physical $15 million into a secure encrypted SEC restitution escrow account, specifically designed to hold recovered stolen funds. But simultaneously, we fed a false confirmation script back to DeAndre's personal laptop. When he checked his banking dashboard on Saturday night, his screen would proudly display a successfully completed transfer to the Cayman Islands. He would see his massive stolen fortune sitting perfectly safe in his offshore account, completely unaware that he was staring at a hollow digital mirage. We successfully built the cage. Now all we had to do was wait for him to confidently step inside and proudly lock the door himself. Saturday night arrived, wrapping the city of Atlanta in a blanket of warm, humid air. The annual Community Excellence Gala was being held at the grand ballroom of the most expensive luxury hotel in the downtown financial district. The sheer irony of the event was absolutely sickening. This gala was supposed to celebrate the most generous charitable leaders in the Black community. The ballroom was lavishly decorated with massive towering floral arrangements, cascading crystal chandeliers, and custom-carved ice sculptures glistening under the warm amber lighting. A live symphony orchestra played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated the room, carrying silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. And sitting right at the center of it all, at the most prominent VIP table in the room, was DeAndre Washington. He looked like a king holding court over his loyal, oblivious subjects. DeAndre wore a breathtakingly expensive custom-tailored velvet tuxedo, holding a crystal glass of bourbon, and flashing his blinding, charismatic smile at the cameras flashing around him. Tonight he was receiving the highest honor of the evening. He was being officially crowned the Philanthropist of the Year for his supposed massive financial contributions to the local neighborhoods. Sitting proudly right next to him was Keisha, wearing a stunning custom beaded evening gown that easily cost $20,000. The intricate diamonds around her neck sparkled fiercely, reflecting the bright ballroom lights. Every single thread of her designer dress, every diamond on her neck, and every drop of bourbon in DeAndre's glass was entirely paid for by the stolen retirement funds of the innocent people sitting at the surrounding tables. Pastor Thomas was seated just 2 tables away, smiling warmly at DeAndre, completely unaware that his entire life savings had been ruthlessly evaporated to fund this extravagant charade. My mother Brenda was seated right next to Pastor Thomas, beaming with absolute overwhelming pride. She wore a new expensive silk dress, her hair perfectly styled, actively accepting the endless compliments from the church elders about what a brilliant, generous son she had raised. She was completely oblivious to the forged second mortgage, the impending bank foreclosure, and the devastating reality that her beloved golden child was preparing to board a private jet in exactly 2 hours, leaving her to face absolute total financial ruin. They were all participating in a beautiful, sparkling lie. While DeAndre and Keisha were busy soaking up the adoration of the crowd, I was standing outside the service entrance in the cold concrete alleyway behind the luxury hotel. I did not look like the defeated, broken sister they had seen crying in the lawyer's office just 2 days ago. I had completely shed the pathetic disguise. I was dressed impeccably in a razor-sharp, bespoke crimson designer suit that fit me with absolute dangerous perfection. The bold red fabric was a stark, aggressive contrast to the quiet, sensible navy suits I usually wore. It was the color of absolute power, of warning, of spilled blood. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, tight, high ponytail, and my makeup was flawless, sharp, and predatory. I looked like a woman who owned the entire building. I did not bother trying to walk through the heavily guarded front entrance where DeAndre's hired security team was actively checking the guest list. I knew the intricate layout of this hotel because I had audited their massive hospitality accounts 3 years ago. I confidently walked right through the underground catering loading dock, swiping a generic vendor access card I had cloned earlier that afternoon. The busy kitchen staff hauling massive trays of hot food completely ignored me, assuming I was a high-level event coordinator making final adjustments. I bypassed the frantic culinary chaos and slipped quietly up the narrow carpeted back stairwell that led directly to the elevated audiovisual control booth overlooking the grand ballroom. The control booth was dark and mostly empty, except for one young technician wearing heavy headphones who was busy monitoring the main soundboard. I flashed a fake federal contractor badge I had printed and coldly informed him that I needed to run a mandatory emergency diagnostic on the primary projection system. He did not ask a single question, simply stepping aside and gesturing toward the main control console. I stood in the dim blue light of the booth, looking down through the tinted glass window at the massive sparkling ballroom below. I had a perfect, unobstructed bird-eye view of DeAndre, laughing loudly at his VIP table. I pulled a sleek silver iPad out of my leather portfolio. This device was directly synced to the SEC War Room and securely linked to the massive high-definition projector screens flanking the main stage down in the ballroom. I quickly bypassed the hotel's internal firewall and successfully tethered my iPad to the main presentation feed, overriding the scheduled slideshow of charitable achievements. I looked at the digital clock glowing brightly on the soundboard console. It was exactly 8:45. DeAndre was scheduled to walk up to the podium and accept his prestigious award in exactly 15 minutes. His fake wire transfer confirmation would officially clear on his phone at exactly 9 o'clock. The timing was absolutely flawless. I stood there in the shadows, gripping the smooth metal edges of the iPad, feeling a cold electric surge of pure adrenaline pumping through my veins. The trap was perfectly set. The explosive charges were securely planted directly under his fraudulent throne. All that was left to do was press the detonator. I left the dim audio-visual control booth and walked briskly down the narrow back stairwell, my expensive heels completely silent on the thick industrial carpet. Pushing firmly through the heavy velvet curtains that separated the service hallway from the grand ballroom, I stepped directly into the main entrance at the absolute back of the massive room. The sheer, breathtaking scale of the exclusive gala event was undeniable from this elevated angle. Hundreds of Atlanta's most prominent and wealthy citizens sat at perfectly arranged circular tables, their eager eyes completely fixed on the brightly glowing main stage. The elegant live symphony orchestra had elegantly faded into complete silence, quickly replaced by the booming, deeply authoritative voice of Pastor Thomas echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. He was proudly standing behind a clear acrylic podium, brilliantly illuminated by a bright white spotlight. He looked incredibly distinguished wearing his absolute best custom-tailored Sunday suit, gently holding a heavy silver plaque that gleamed beautifully in the warm ambient light. When we look for true visionary leaders in our great community, Pastor Thomas preached passionately, his rich voice trembling with deep, genuine emotion. We look for those rare individuals who do not just build immense wealth for themselves, but those who actively and selflessly build up the vulnerable people around them. We specifically look for men of high moral character, men of deep, unwavering faith, men who fiercely honor their families and tirelessly protect our most vulnerable elders. He paused dramatically, slowly, wiping a small single tear from his wrinkled eye entirely, and tragically ignorant of the horrific fact that he was publicly worshiping the exact deceitful man who had secretly and maliciously bankrupted his entire lifelong retirement account. DeAndre Washington is undoubtedly that incredible man. He is a bright, shining beacon of pure hope for our struggling youth. He has definitively proven that with relentless hard work, deep spiritual dedication, and a truly generous heart, we can successfully build powerful generational wealth right here in our very own precious neighborhoods. It is my absolute profound honor to proudly present the prestigious Philanthropist of the Year award to a brilliant, successful son of our very own loving congregation. The entire massive ballroom instantly erupted into wild, deafening applause. Heavy wooden chairs scraped loudly against the highly polished marble floor as the incredibly wealthy attendees enthusiastically stood up generously, giving DeAndre a massive extended standing ovation. DeAndre stood up incredibly slowly, smoothly, buttoning his expensive custom velvet tuxedo jacket with a highly practiced, wonderfully elegant sweeping motion. He smiled broadly with brilliant, perfectly practiced fake humility, waving gracefully and confidently to the loudly cheering crowd surrounding him. He slowly turned and gently kissed Keisha affectionately on the cheek, who was clapping aggressively and rapidly, actively making absolutely sure all the hired event photographers successfully captured her perfect, deeply supportive, loyal wife angle. My mother Brenda was practically leaping entirely out of her front row seat, joyfully clapping so incredibly hard, her heavy diamond bracelets loudly clinked together. DeAndre began his slow, deeply victorious, confident walk directly toward the stage steps, arrogantly soaking in the absolute blind adoration of the very innocent people he had completely and ruthlessly ruined. I aggressively gripped my heavy silver iPad firmly in my left hand, squared my posture, and bravely stepped out from the dark shadows of the velvet curtains. I began my relentless walk straight down the incredibly long, wide center aisle. The bright, aggressive crimson fabric of my sharp, bespoke suit violently caught the ambient golden light immediately. Shocked whispers rapidly began to ripple chaotically through the enormous room. People actively pointed their previously joyful expressions rapidly shifting to absolute confusion and pure shock. They immediately recognized me. They recognized the disgraced criminal sister they had viciously cursed on social media. But I absolutely walked with the lethal, terrifying precision of an apex predator rapidly closing in on its trapped prey. DeAndre abruptly turned around his supremely confident smile, instantly freezing permanently as his wide eyes locked directly onto me. His dark skin instantly turned a pale, sickly gray. Keisha quickly saw me, and her perfectly contoured, beautiful face violently twisted into a horrifying mask of pure, unfiltered, absolute panic. She clumsily knocked over her expensive champagne flute and frantically jumped up. "Security!" Keisha shrieked, insanely, loudly, aggressively grabbing a spare microphone from a nearby metal stand. "Get this dangerous criminal completely out of here right now. She is illegally trespassing. Call the city police." Two massive, highly trained guards aggressively rushed quickly forward to physically intercept me. I absolutely did not flinch. I confidently reached directly into my deep breast pocket, smoothly pulled out a bright yellow laminated federal agent badge, and powerfully held it high. "I am currently operating under the direct, absolute authorization of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I aggressively projected loudly across the entirely silent ballroom. "Interfere physically with me, and you will be immediately arrested for criminally obstructing an active official federal raid." The large armed guards instantly stopped completely dead, slowly, nervously backing far away. I confidently walked right past my trembling mother, who had dramatically collapsed deep into her plush chair in sheer total disbelief. I finally reached the wide carpeted stage steps. DeAndre desperately tried to physically block my direct upward path, but I brutally bumped my shoulder incredibly hard against his chest, forcefully and angrily shoving him completely out of my way. He clumsily stumbled backward, his expensive jacket awkwardly catching on the brass handrail. I powerfully strode directly across the highly polished stage, directly up to the clear acrylic podium. Pastor Thomas was tightly gripping the sharp edges, his sweating face entirely pale. "Zaria, what is the absolute meaning of this?" he furiously demanded, his angry voice shaking violently. "You have terribly disgraced this loving family." I absolutely did not argue. I simply reached quickly out and incredibly firmly took the microphone straight out of his visibly trembling, weak hand. I slowly turned to firmly face the utterly massive, wealthy crowd. 500 of Atlanta's most powerful elite citizens were intently staring at me in absolute, entirely breathless, total silence. I aggressively locked my dark eyes directly with DeAndre, who nervously stepped onto the wooden stage exactly 10 short feet away. "Good evening," I boldly said, my steady voice perfectly calm and terrifyingly, flawlessly cold. "My given name is Zaria Washington. 2 agonizing days ago, the deceitful man you are honoring tonight, publicly and maliciously, accused me of orchestrating a massive $15 million financial fraud. His cruel wife went on social media and falsely told this entire community that I ruthlessly stole your retirement funds. You foolishly sent me violent death threats. You heartlessly threw me completely onto the dangerous street. But hard numbers absolutely do not ever lie, and they certainly do not magically care about incredibly fake dramatic tears on Instagram." I gently placed my silver iPad entirely flat onto the clear acrylic podium and perfectly connected the primary display cable directly into the hotel's massive central projection feed. "Let us rapidly start with the fake luxury real estate empire," I confidently announced incredibly loudly. "Keisha Washington has selfishly spent 2 years aggressively convincing you all that she is successfully brokering highly exclusive, high net worth luxury buyers. Basta wasad sai. I firmly tapped the bright iPad screen just once. Immediately, the 2 massive projector screens flawlessly flanking the main stage violently flashed blindingly to bright life. Proudly displayed in massive, entirely undeniable, high-resolution, bright red text were highly official county property deeds, accurately matching tax identification numbers, and deeply legally buried fraudulent corporate registration documents. If you closely look directly at the huge screens securely behind me, you will plainly see the actual legally, officially filed real purchasing documents for every single luxury mansion Keisha falsely claims to have legally sold. I boldly continued, my sharp voice perfectly slicing right through the suffocated, terrified, heavy silence. There were absolutely entirely no real exclusive wealthy buyers. Every single massive property was quietly and illegally purchased by a highly interconnected criminal network of completely anonymous fake ghost corporations. And all those empty shell companies were illegally funded directly by a highly centralized offshore holding account maliciously controlled entirely by DeAndre. A deeply collective shocked gasp rapidly rippled violently throughout the huge ballroom. People immediately began aggressively squinting intensely at the entirely undeniable legal financial documents highly projected directly in absolute front of their faces. The damning evidence was completely and utterly irrefutable. I firmly tapped the bright screen once again, instantly bringing completely up a visually simplified, incredibly deeply damning money flow chart. Keisha was absolutely not legally selling actual houses. I coldly stated, my commanding tone flawlessly dropping entirely into a very sharp, highly clinical professional register. She was actively, intentionally laundering your stolen cash. DeAndre would maliciously funnel your stolen retirement funds straight into these exact fake corporate entities. Keisha would then illegally broker the sale of a luxury property to those exact entities, collecting a massive six-figure commission check from the fraudulent transaction. They were literally using your stolen life savings to pay her salary, washing the dirty money right under your noses while demanding you applaud their success. The crowd erupted. It was a chaotic, furious roar of absolute outrage. Men in expensive suits jumped out of their chairs, shouting angrily toward the stage. The women at the VIP tables began pointing furiously at Keisha, screaming insults. Pastor Thomas grabbed the podium, staring at the massive screens with his mouth wide open, completely unable to process the horrifying reality that his beloved community fund had been used to buy Keisha's designer shoes. Keisha dropped her spare microphone. It hit the floor with a loud screech. She covered her face with her hands, frantically trying to push her way through the angry crowd toward the exit, but the church elders intentionally blocked her path, completely trapping her in the center of the furious room. The betrayal cut deeper than anything they had ever experienced. I watched as Mr. Vance, the retired postal worker who had invested his entire pension, slumped into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, as the devastating reality of his total financial ruin washed over him. Mrs. Higgins, the sweet 80-year-old widow from our childhood neighborhood, pointed her cane directly at DeAndre, screaming at the absolute top of her frail lungs. The pure, unadulterated venom in the room was entirely suffocating. They were ready to tear him apart. Suddenly, I felt a hot breath on my neck. DeAndre had stalked up behind me while the crowd was distracted. He leaned in close. "You are crazy," DeAndre sneered, whispering off microphone. "You can show them fake property deeds. It does not matter. The bank accounts are empty. The money is gone. You have no proof of the money, and I am leaving in 1 hour." I slowly turned my head. I simply smiled, a terrifying smile that made his arrogant expression falter. "Are you sure about that, DeAndre?" I whispered back. I slowly turned my dark eyes back to the brightly glowing digital screen of my silver iPad and decisively hit the next button. The massive digital screens behind me instantly shifted from the fraudulent real estate deeds to a split-screen display that was entirely devastating in its absolute clarity. I did not need to explain complex accounting principles or offshore tax havens to this crowd. I just needed to show them the cold, hard math of their own betrayal. On the left side of the massive projectors, I displayed the exact, highly confidential bank statements I had pulled from DeAndre's mirrored hard drive. The specific names and account numbers were brightly highlighted in neon yellow. Pastor Thomas's retirement account showing a massive withdrawal of $400,000. The Mount Zion Baptist Church Youth Center Building Fund showing a complete liquidation of $2.5 million. The lifelong pension fund of the elderly widow Mrs. Higgins completely drained to zero. On the right side of the split screen, I displayed the corresponding receipts, perfectly matching the exact dates of the stolen funds. It was a flawless visual timeline of unchecked, absolute greed. 3 days after Pastor Thomas's entire retirement account was quietly emptied, a wire transfer for the exact same amount was sent to a luxury automotive dealership in Buckhead. I displayed the official signed title for a brand new fully loaded Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon. The vehicle was registered directly in Keisha Washington's name. Directly below that, I linked the stolen church youth fund to a massive receipt from an exclusive diamond jeweler in Switzerland. The sheer audacity of his purchases was nauseating. He had casually spent $150,000 on custom matching Rolex watches and diamond tennis bracelets the very same week he stood at the church pulpit and prayed for the community's financial growth. Every single transaction was meticulously documented, leaving absolutely zero room for doubt or misinterpretation. The visual evidence was absolutely bulletproof. I had literally painted a massive neon line directly from their empty pockets to Keisha's diamond necklace and DeAndre's expensive driveway. The initial shock that had paralyzed the grand ballroom instantly violently shattered. The heavy, suffocating silence was entirely ripped apart by a deafening, visceral roar of absolute collective agony and ferocious outrage. It was not just anger. It was the sound of a deeply betrayed family realizing they had been deliberately slaughtered by one of their own. Men in expensive tailored suits began knocking over the heavy circular tables, the crystal centerpieces shattering loudly against the polished marble floor. Women were screaming, pointing accusing fingers directly at the stage, their faces contorted with absolute pure fury. Pastor Thomas, a man who had stood as a towering pillar of unshakable strength in our community for over 40 years, physically collapsed. His knees buckled out from under him, and he hit the hard floor with a heavy, sickening thud. He buried his face deep into his trembling hands, sobbing openly and violently, as the devastating reality washed completely over him. His entire life's work, the legacy he had promised to leave for his grandchildren, was entirely gone, traded for a shiny black SUV and a diamond watch. Several deacons rushed to his side, trying to pull him up, but they were also weeping, completely devastated by the sheer magnitude of the absolute betrayal. The raw emotion flooding the ballroom was incredibly thick, a suffocating mixture of profound grief and explosive rage. Keisha knew exactly what was coming. Her perfectly constructed fake world was violently burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. She quickly dropped her designer clutch, hiked up the heavy silk skirt of her $20,000 custom gown, and frantically tried to run. She desperately darted toward the dark side exit of the ballroom, hoping to completely disappear into the shadows before the angry crowd could physically reach her. But she severely underestimated the fierce protective wrath of the Mount Zion Church mothers. These were the older women who had baked cookies for our Sunday school, the women who spent hours praying for our success, the women whose own hard-earned savings had just been entirely wiped out to fund Keisha's lavish fake lifestyle. As Keisha desperately lunged for the heavy brass exit doors, a solid wall of angry women firmly blocked her path. They formed an impenetrable physical barrier, their eyes blazing with righteous fury. These women had survived decades of struggle and hardship, only to have their twilight years robbed by a woman who mocked them on the internet. "Where do you think you are going?" one of the older women shouted aggressively, shoving Keisha backward. Keisha stumbled in her expensive high heels, her perfectly styled hair completely falling out of place. "Get your hands off of me!" Keisha shrieked hysterically, desperately looking around for the hired security guards. But the security team had completely backed away, entirely unwilling to physically fight an angry mob of elderly churchwomen over a confirmed federal criminal. The church mothers tightly circled her, aggressively pointing their fingers in her face, relentlessly screaming about the stolen money, entirely trapping her in a corner of the ballroom. Keisha pressed her back hard against the floral wallpaper, shaking violently, her fake glamorous facade completely shattered. The sparkling diamonds around her neck suddenly looked incredibly cheap, a disgusting symbol of her absolute moral bankruptcy. Her whimpers were entirely drowned out by their furious demands for immediate justice. DeAndre was completely frozen on the stage behind me. His arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the wide-eyed absolute sheer terror of a cornered rat. He nervously looked at the massive screens, then at the furious riot breaking out in the ballroom, finally realizing his brilliant digital fortress had been completely dismantled. He stepped backward, looking wildly around the room for any possible route of escape, but the furious crowd was rapidly closing in on all sides. But there was one person in the room who absolutely violently refused to accept the undeniable truth glaring brightly from the projector screens. My mother. Brenda Washington violently pushed her way through the chaotic, screaming crowd, knocking over chairs and shoving people aside with a terrifying, entirely blind desperation. She refused to look at the bank statements. She refused to look at the broken pastor sobbing on the floor. She only saw her beloved golden child standing on the stage looking scared, and her deeply ingrained delusional instinct to aggressively protect him took complete, absolute control over her mind. She would rather watch the entire world burn than admit her son was a monster. She angrily stomped up the carpeted stage steps, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, furious rage. I stood my ground directly behind the clear acrylic podium, my hands resting lightly on the cold plastic, completely anticipating her desperate, aggressive reaction. I knew she would attack me. She always attacked the messenger when the absolute truth threatened her perfect golden illusion. Brenda marched straight toward me, raised her hand, and violently slapped me entirely across the face. The sharp, incredibly loud crack of her palm hitting my cheek echoed sharply through the podium microphone, sending a brief, piercing wave of audio feedback ringing through the massive speakers. The sheer, forceful impact violently snapped my head to the side. A sharp, stinging heat rapidly spread across my skin, but I did not stumble. I did not fall. The physical pain was entirely insignificant compared to the emotional closure it provided. That single violent action completely severed the final fraying thread of my daughterly obligation. She had chosen her side permanently, fully cementing her allegiance to a criminal over her own innocent daughter. I slowly turned my head back to look directly into her entirely wild, deeply hateful eyes. "Stop lying on your brother!" Brenda screamed hysterically into my face, her chest heaving heavily, completely ignoring the massive federal evidence projected directly behind her. "You evil, jealous, wicked little girl. You fabricated all of these fake papers because you are utterly desperate to completely destroy his happiness. He is a profoundly good man. He is a wealthy man of God. He aggressively takes care of this family while you do absolutely nothing but try to bring us down." She turned frantically toward the completely enraged crowd, waving her hands desperately in the air, trying to manually shout down the furious riot. "Do not listen to her!" Brenda desperately pleaded at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with insane denial. "My son did not steal your money. Zarya is the one the federal agents arrested. Zarya is the one who owns the criminal company. She is the liar. DeAndre provides everything for me. He is a wonderful, perfect son. He takes care of this family." I stood perfectly still, letting her scream until her lungs were completely exhausted. The crowd had gone entirely quiet again, watching this horrifying family display, with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound pity. Brenda finally turned back to me, heavily breathing, her eyes begging me to somehow take it all back, to somehow restore the golden illusion of her beloved son. "You claim he provides everything for you. You firmly believe he is your ultimate protector and your greatest achievement in this lifetime. But numbers do not harbor any sentimental feelings, Mom. Numbers only reveal the absolute unvarnished reality." I slowly reached up and gently touched my stinging cheek, feeling the warm red mark her hand had left on my skin. I did not feel any anger toward her anymore. I only felt a deep, cold, absolute pity for a woman who was about to lose absolutely everything because she chose to blindly worship a completely false idol. I carefully tapped the bright screen of my silver iPad one final time, preparing to entirely shatter her entire reality. "Does he, Mom?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm and echoing clearly through the entire silent ballroom. "Let us look at your house." I firmly pressed my finger against the smooth glass screen of my silver iPad. The massive projectors behind me instantly shifted away from Keisha's fraudulent real estate deeds and DeAndre's luxury shopping receipts. The bright screens filled entirely with a highly official commercial bank document. The bold black letters at the very top of the page clearly read, "Notice of default and imminent foreclosure." Beneath that terrifying legal header was a crystal-clear photograph of the beautiful sprawling brick house that my late father had spent his entire life working to completely pay off. The house Brenda was currently living in. The house she bragged about every single Sunday to her church friends. I looked directly at my mother. Her hand was still raised slightly in the air from slapping my face, but her angry expression rapidly dissolved into absolute sheer confusion. Her eyes darted frantically back and forth across the massive digital text, desperately trying to comprehend the legal banking jargon displayed so prominently for 500 people to read. 6 months ago, DeAndre made a massive, highly leveraged gamble on an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange. I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the stunned silence of the grand ballroom. He lost millions of dollars in a matter of minutes. Desperate to cover his massive margin calls before his wealthy investors noticed the missing capital, he needed an immediate, massive influx of untraceable cash. He did not sell his expensive sports cars. He did not ask his wife to sell her designer jewelry. Instead, he quietly went to the one person who trusted him completely blindly. I zoomed in on the bottom of the projected banking document, brightly highlighting a specific signature line. He secretly took out a $3 million second mortgage against the fully paid equity of your home. Mom, I stated coldly, staring right into her terrified eyes. He placed a massive high-interest commercial loan directly onto your property. And because he stopped making those massive monthly payments 3 months ago, the bank officially issued a final notice of default yesterday afternoon. By 9 o'clock on Monday morning, county sheriffs will physically arrive at your front door to change the locks and throw all of your possessions onto the front lawn. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. You are losing your home. The sheer brutal cruelty of the revelation hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The angry shouting and chaotic rioting abruptly stopped, instantly replaced by a horrifying, completely suffocating silence. Even the furious church mothers who had fiercely cornered Keisha near the exit doors stopped yelling, turning their shocked faces back toward the main stage. Stealing from anonymous community investors was a devastating federal crime. But ruthlessly stealing the very roof over your own elderly mother's head, stealing the sacred home your own father had bled to provide, was an act of pure, absolute sociopathic evil that defied all human comprehension. Brenda stood completely frozen on the stage. The heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists suddenly looked like cheap, heavy chains, dragging her violently down into a dark, bottomless abyss. The bright, confident glow of the proud mother instantly vanished, violently replaced by the hollow, trembling shell of a deeply broken woman. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but absolutely no sound came out. She slowly turned her head away from the massive projector screens, her eyes completely wide with raw, unfiltered terror. She looked frantically toward DeAndre. He was standing just a few feet away, awkwardly adjusting the cuffs of his expensive custom velvet tuxedo. He refused to look her in the eye. He stared intensely at the floor, his jaw tightly clenched in extreme anger. He was not angry that his mother was losing her home. He was violently angry that he had been publicly caught. "Tell me it is a lie," Brenda whispered. Her voice was incredibly weak, trembling violently, with a desperate, deeply pathetic hope. She took a slow, stumbling step toward her beloved golden child. "DeAndre, please. Tell them your sister is lying again. Tell them you did not touch my house. Tell me you did not take your father's house." DeAndre remained completely silent, his dark eyes fiercely locked onto the polished wooden floorboards of the stage. Brenda lunged forward desperately, grabbing the lapels of his expensive velvet jacket with both of her trembling hands. She shook him frantically, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her perfectly applied, expensive makeup. "Tell me it is a lie, DeAndre!" She screamed hysterically, her voice echoing painfully throughout the completely silent ballroom. "You promised me you were protecting our wealth. You promised me you were taking care of me. Tell me you did not sell my home." For a brief second, I actually thought DeAndre might try to comfort her. I thought he might offer one final desperate lie to soothe the woman who had literally sacrificed her other child to protect him just moments ago. But DeAndre Washington was entirely incapable of genuine human empathy. When cornered, a narcissist will always aggressively, viciously turn on their most loyal enablers to protect their own fragile ego. DeAndre aggressively grabbed his mother's wrists and violently tore her hands off his expensive jacket. He did not gently push her away. He shoved her backward with incredible, brutal force. Brenda gasped in absolute shock, her expensive high heels slipping awkwardly on the polished wood. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing wildly until she heavily collapsed onto the hard stage floor. "You signed whatever I put in front of you, old woman," DeAndre snarled viciously, his voice dripping with absolute venom and pure, unfiltered disgust. He stood over her, looking down at the woman who gave him life, as if she were a piece of disgusting garbage stuck to his expensive shoe. "You always signed exactly what I told you to sign because you loved the lavish lifestyle I provided for you. You loved the expensive dinners and the fancy dresses. You never once bothered to read the actual paperwork because you were too busy bragging to your church friends about your rich son. That is your own fault. Do not stand here crying and blaming me for your own pathetic blind ignorance." The entire ballroom gasped collectively at the sheer, brutal violence of his words. Brenda sat crumpled on the floor, staring up at the monster she had carefully created and fiercely protected her entire life. A loud, deeply agonizing wail suddenly erupted from deep inside her chest. It was the horrific sound of a completely shattered reality. She buried her face in her hands and began violently weeping in absolute hysterics, rocking back and forth on the hard stage floor. She had absolutely nothing left. No home, no money, no golden child, and a daughter she had entirely alienated forever. She was completely, utterly destroyed. DeAndre violently turned away from his sobbing mother, completely devoid of any remorse. He aggressively marched over to a fallen microphone stand, snatched the heavy silver microphone off the floor, and turned to directly face the utterly disgusted crowd. His eyes were completely wild, flashing with a manic, terrifyingly delusional arrogance. He actually believed he had already won. He actually believed he was entirely invincible. DeAndre threw his head back and laughed loudly into the microphone. It was a dark, completely manic sound that echoed violently against the high-vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. "You think you have entirely ruined me?" DeAndre shouted aggressively into the microphone, wildly gesturing toward the massive projector screens displaying his horrific financial crimes. "You think these pathetic papers actually mean anything right now? You are all completely stupid. Every single one of you. You wanted the easy money, and I took it from you because you were entirely weak." He turned his manic gaze directly toward me, a vicious, wildly triumphant grin stretching aggressively across his face. "You went through all this incredible theatrical trouble," Zaria DeAndre mocked loudly, pacing aggressively back and forth across the stage. "You hacked my computers. You stole my files. You brought all these pathetic people here to humiliate me. But it absolutely does not matter. Your entire massive plan is a complete pathetic failure." He reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket and pulled out his sleek smartphone, waving it aggressively in the air like a victorious weapon. "It does not matter!" DeAndre screamed triumphantly, his voice booming heavily over the sound system. "The money is gone. It hit my offshore account exactly 10 minutes ago. The international wire transfer has completely officially cleared. I am untouchable. The money is entirely beyond the jurisdiction of the federal government. It is completely out of your pathetic reach. I am boarding a private luxury jet tonight, and there is absolutely nothing you or the FBI can physically do to stop me. I am a wealthy king." The furious crowd began screaming again, surging aggressively forward toward the stage. Their faces twisted in absolute desperate panic at the thought of their life savings permanently disappearing into a tropical tax haven. Keisha, seeing a brief momentary distraction, desperately tried to push past the church mothers again, violently clawing at the heavy brass exit doors. I stood perfectly still behind the clear acrylic podium, completely unaffected by the chaotic screaming and DeAndre's manic, triumphant performance. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I slowly reached into the deep pocket of my sharp crimson blazer and pulled out my securely encrypted federal smartphone. I looked at the bright screen, instantly verifying the absolutely flawless execution of the secure cyber operation. The digital trap had snapped completely shut. I calmly walked out from behind the clear acrylic podium. My expensive heels clicked sharply and rhythmically against the polished wooden floorboards as I purposefully closed the physical distance between us. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, terrifying, entirely inevitable precision of an absolute executioner approaching the block. DeAndre stopped his manic pacing. His wildly triumphant grin faltered slightly as he watched me approach. He expected me to be screaming in frustration. He expected me to be crying tears of absolute bitter defeat. Instead, I was smiling. It was a cold, incredibly dangerous smile that completely froze the hot, manic blood running through his veins. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, completely invading his personal space. I looked directly into his panicked, rapidly shifting eyes. The deafening, chaotic noise of the furious ballroom around us seemed to instantly fade into absolute total silence. "You really should have hired a better CPA," I whispered, my voice radiating a deadly, absolutely terrifying calm. I pointed firmly at the massive projector screen behind me. The glowing green checkmark faded, and a highly official document appeared. It was a legally binding federal restitution order, already signed by a federal judge. "Every dime is being returned to the community on Monday," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute undeniable finality. "You have exactly $0." DeAndre let out a guttural sound that barely resembled a human voice. It was the desperate, suffocating gasp of a man completely drowning in his own hubris. He frantically looked down at his smartphone. His thumbs aggressively hammered against the smooth glass screen, violently swiping and tapping as he desperately tried to refresh the banking application. But the fake Cayman Islands confirmation screen had already completely vanished. In its place, a stark, terrifying image locked his phone completely. It was the official heavy golden seal of the Department of Justice, accompanied by bright red text that read, "Asset seized by federal order." "No," DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he violently shook the expensive device. "No, this is completely impossible. The routing numbers were heavily encrypted. The blockchain was completely anonymous. You cannot do this to me. I am DeAndre Washington. I built this entire empire." He aggressively threw the useless smartphone directly at the stage floor. It shattered violently against the polished wood, pieces of expensive glass flying in every direction. He looked wildly around the massive grand ballroom, his dark eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. He was desperately searching for a physical way out. He took a sudden, frantic step toward the heavy velvet curtains draped across the back of the stage, clearly intending to completely abandon his wife, abandon his mother, and desperately flee into the dark Atlanta night with absolutely nothing but the expensive velvet tuxedo on his back. But he was entirely out of time. Before his custom leather shoe could even touch the second wooden floorboard, the massive, heavy brass doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom violently burst completely open. The deafening sound of the heavy wood slamming against the plaster walls echoed like a massive thunderclap, instantly silencing the chaotic murmurs of the stunned crowd. "Federal agents, nobody move," a powerful, incredibly deep voice boomed through the room. Agent Sterling marched aggressively through the shattered entrance, his federal badge held high in the air, a heavy tactical weapon strapped tightly to his chest. Behind him, a massive swarm of heavily armed FBI agents and SEC federal marshals aggressively flooded into the grand ballroom. They moved with terrifying, highly coordinated military precision. The flashing red and blue lights from the dozens of federal cruisers parked illegally outside the luxury hotel violently illuminated the dark hallway behind them, casting long, terrifying shadows across the expensive marble floors. The incredibly wealthy gala attendees immediately began screaming in absolute sheer panic, diving aggressively under their expensive circular tables and throwing their hands over their heads. The remaining private hotel security guards instantly dropped their radios aggressively, raising their hands in total surrender, completely unwilling to physically engage with a massive federal tactical raid. "Secure the exits," Agent Sterling commanded aggressively, his sharp eyes scanning the massive room until they locked directly onto the stage. "Apprehend the primary targets immediately." A dozen heavily armed tactical agents aggressively sprinted straight down the wide center aisle, their heavy combat boots pounding violently against the plush red carpet. DeAndre completely froze on the stage. His arrogant mind simply could not process the absolute terrifying reality of his immediate physical downfall. He just stood there, his mouth wide open, staring at the incoming federal wave. Two massive FBI agents aggressively charged up the carpeted stage steps. DeAndre finally panicked. He desperately raised his hands, trying to awkwardly back away, but there was absolutely nowhere to go. The first agent aggressively grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his custom velvet tuxedo and violently spun him completely around. The agent aggressively slammed DeAndre face first directly onto the clear acrylic podium. The sheer forceful impact violently knocked the remaining breath completely out of DeAndre's lungs. "Put your hands behind your back right now!" The federal agent screamed aggressively, violently, twisting DeAndre's arms painfully behind his back. The heavy cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly and violently around DeAndre's wrists, permanently locking his hands together. DeAndre Washington, you are under federal arrest for massive wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. You have the absolute right to remain silent. DeAndre did not remain silent. He began sobbing violently. The incredibly arrogant, wealthy mastermind who had ruthlessly mocked his victims just 10 minutes ago was now aggressively crying like a terrified child. The heavy, clear acrylic podium cracked slightly under his shifting weight as the agents aggressively pinned him down. On the opposite side of the massive ballroom, complete physical chaos violently erupted. Keisha, seeing the federal agents aggressively storming the room, had made one final desperate, incredibly frantic attempt to completely escape the angry church mothers. She aggressively shoved an elderly woman out of the way and desperately sprinted toward the catering exit, but she did not even make it 5 feet. Two female federal marshals aggressively intercepted her. Keisha violently fought back, screaming hysterically and aggressively, swinging her expensive designer clutch at the officers' heads. The marshals absolutely did not hesitate. They aggressively grabbed her flailing arms and violently slammed her face first directly onto the nearest catering table. Crystal champagne flutes and silver trays violently crashed to the marble floor, completely covering Keisha in expensive sticky alcohol and shattered glass. "Get off of me!" Keisha shrieked aggressively, her face violently pressed into the white tablecloth. "Do you know who I am? I am a highly successful real estate broker. You cannot arrest me. My husband will completely destroy your careers." The federal marshal aggressively pulled Keisha's arms forcefully behind her back. As she aggressively wrestled the struggling woman into the heavy steel handcuffs, the delicate, incredibly expensive silk fabric of Keisha's $20,000 custom designer gown violently snagged on the sharp edge of the shattered catering table. With a loud, incredibly sickening rip, the heavy beaded fabric violently tore completely down the side, aggressively exposing her undergarments and completely destroying the ridiculously expensive dress paid for by stolen retirement funds. "You are going to federal prison," the marshal stated coldly, aggressively yanking Keisha back up to her feet. The federal agents aggressively grabbed DeAndre by his upper arms and violently dragged him away from the cracked acrylic podium. They forcefully marched him directly down the stage steps. Agent Sterling aggressively grabbed Keisha by her arm, physically dragging her struggling, completely humiliated body over to join her husband. The federal agents aggressively formed a tight physical perimeter around the completely ruined couple, rapidly preparing to fiercely march them straight down the massive center aisle and out the front doors. The perp walk was incredibly long, entirely, completely brutal, and absolutely undeniably deserved. As the federal agents aggressively dragged DeAndre and Keisha straight down the center aisle, the deeply traumatized community members completely lost their remaining physical restraint. The absolute sheer magnitude of the betrayal violently ignited a completely uncontrollable communal rage. Men and women aggressively surged forward violently, pressing heavily against the tight federal perimeter. "You absolute monster!" a man screamed aggressively, violently, throwing a crumpled linen napkin directly at DeAndre's face. "You completely stole my children's college fund." The furious church mothers aggressively lined the aisle, their faces violently contorted with pure, unadulterated disgust. One of the elderly women violently spit aggressively onto the marble floor right directly in front of Keisha's expensive torn designer shoes. Keisha violently sobbed desperately, trying to aggressively hide her ruined face behind her own shoulder, her absolute fake glamorous facade entirely, completely, violently obliterated. DeAndre kept his head aggressively forced down, staring completely blankly at the floor. He aggressively refused to look at the terrified faces of the innocent people he had completely ruined. He aggressively refused to look at Pastor Thomas, and he absolutely aggressively refused to look at his own mother. Brenda was still sitting completely crumpled on the hard wooden stage. She aggressively watched her beloved perfect golden child aggressively dragged away in heavy steel chains like a common violent criminal. She violently sobbed aggressively, rocking back and forth, completely unable to process the absolute violent destruction of her entire delusional reality. I stood completely perfectly still on the main stage, watching the heavy brass doors violently close directly behind the federal agents. The massive flashing red and blue lights violently faded completely into the dark Atlanta night. The massive $15 million financial nightmare was completely entirely over. The incredibly toxic, violently abusive family that had aggressively tried to permanently destroy me was completely entirely violently dismantled. 6 months later, the federal court heavily delivered its absolute final unyielding judgment. DeAndre Washington aggressively refused to take a plea deal, incredibly arrogantly, believing his expensive corporate lawyers could somehow aggressively beat the massive federal government. The federal jury aggressively deliberated for less than exactly 2 hours before violently returning a massive guilty verdict on all 47 heavy felony counts. The federal judge aggressively sentenced him to 25 absolute years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slight possibility of early parole. Keisha Washington aggressively turned completely against him, violently testifying directly for the prosecution in a desperate attempt to aggressively save herself. It absolutely did not work. She was aggressively sentenced to 10 hard years in federal prison and aggressively permanently stripped of her real estate license. All of their fraudulent assets were aggressively violently seized and entirely completely liquidated. Brenda Washington violently lost her massive, beautiful home to the commercial bank foreclosure, exactly as the heavy document predicted. She aggressively moved into a tiny, entirely run-down one-bedroom apartment on the aggressive bad side of town. With no golden child to violently fund her expensive lifestyle, and no church community aggressively willing to physically speak to her, she was left completely entirely alone. Yesterday afternoon, my securely encrypted office phone loudly rang. I aggressively recognized the completely unregistered number immediately. I calmly pressed the speaker button. Zaria, my mother's incredibly weak, violently trembling voice crackled aggressively through the speaker. Please. The heavy heating bill is completely overdue. I have absolutely no food in the refrigerator. I have absolutely no one left in this world. Please let me come aggressively move in with you. I am your mother. You have to actively forgive me. I sat aggressively comfortably behind my massive imported glass desk, staring out the wide floor-to-ceiling window at the beautiful, sprawling Atlanta skyline. I did not feel aggressively angry. I did not feel aggressively sad. I felt absolutely entirely completely free. You violently made your absolute choice at that barbecue, Mom, I stated with incredible absolute deadly calm. I am absolutely not your safety net. I aggressively firmly pressed the red button, completely ending the call, and aggressively permanently blocked her number from the server forever. I aggressively stood up, fiercely smoothing the sharp lapels of my impeccably tailored designer suit. I aggressively walked out of my beautiful, expansive corner office, completely ready to actively, ruthlessly, aggressively tackle the absolutely brilliant, completely independent future I had fiercely built entirely with my own 2 hands. Have you ever aggressively had to actively, aggressively walk completely away from toxic blood to violently find your absolute true worth? Let me actively know down in the comments. Hit like and aggressively subscribe if you enjoyed this journey to justice. The massive federal raid at the Community Excellence Gala became the biggest news story in Atlanta for weeks. News helicopters circled the federal courthouse constantly. My name was officially cleared immediately, and the entire community praised my brave actions. The immediate aftermath was an absolute whirlwind of aggressive federal subpoenas, relentless media coverage, and endless court appearances. I worked closely with Agent Sterling and the Securities and Exchange Commission every single day, meticulously ensuring every stolen penny was perfectly routed back to the rightful owners. Pastor Thomas and the church elders wept openly when the federal government officially restored their entire community fund and their personal retirement accounts. They publicly apologized to me in front of the entire congregation, completely retracting their vicious accusations. But the true closure did not arrive until exactly 6 months later, inside a cold, heavily guarded federal courtroom in downtown Atlanta. The courtroom was completely packed with former church members who watched his downfall. Despite overwhelming evidence, DeAndre Washington aggressively refused a generous plea deal offered by the federal prosecutor. His immense narcissistic arrogance completely convinced him that his high-priced corporate defense attorneys could effortlessly manipulate the federal jury. He was absolutely wrong. The federal prosecutors used my heavily encrypted data mirrors, the offshore routing logs, and the forged documents to build an absolutely bulletproof case. During the 2-week trial, DeAndre sat at the defense table, his custom-tailored suits looking increasingly oversized as the massive stress physically consumed him. Keisha aggressively turned on him entirely, taking the witness stand for the prosecution, frantically sobbing and violently blaming him for absolutely everything in a desperate, pathetic attempt to completely save herself. It absolutely did not work. The federal jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before delivering a massive, undeniable guilty verdict on all 47 heavy felony counts. The federal judge looked down from the high mahogany bench with pure, unfiltered disgust. He aggressively sentenced DeAndre to 25 absolute years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any slight possibility of early parole. Keisha was aggressively sentenced to 10 hard years in federal prison for her active role in the money laundering syndicate. Furthermore, the judge permanently and aggressively revoked her real estate license, ensuring she could never legally sell another property again. All of their remaining fraudulent assets, including the massive luxury estate and the expensive imported vehicles, were violently seized and completely liquidated to pay massive federal fines. While DeAndre and Keisha were physically dragged away in heavy steel chains, my mother Brenda faced her own absolute agonizing reality. The commercial bank aggressively finalized the foreclosure on her beautiful, sprawling brick home, exactly as the heavy document predicted during the dramatic gala. She was violently evicted, her expensive furniture unceremoniously dumped onto the front lawn by armed county sheriffs. With absolutely no golden child to aggressively fund her lavish lifestyle and no church community willing to even look in her direction, Brenda was forced to rapidly relocate to a tiny, incredibly run-down apartment on the incredibly dangerous side of the city. Yesterday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk when my securely encrypted private office phone loudly rang. I immediately recognized the unregistered number on the caller identification screen. I took a deep breath, perfectly steadying my emotions, and calmly pressed the green speaker button. Zaria, my mother's incredibly weak, violently trembling voice crackled aggressively through the small speaker. She cried hysterically, begging for mercy. Please, you have to listen to me. The heating bill is completely overdue. I have absolutely no food in my refrigerator. The neighborhood is incredibly dangerous. I have absolutely no one left in this entire world. You have to let me come move in with you. I am your mother. You have to actively forgive me for what happened. I sat perfectly still, listening to the desperate, pathetic pleading of the woman who had violently slapped my face and publicly threw me to the federal wolves to protect a ruthless criminal. I did not feel any anger. I did not feel any lingering sadness. I simply felt an absolute profound emptiness regarding her existence. You violently made your absolute choice at that barbecue, Mom, I stated, my voice radiating an incredible, absolute, deadly calm. You aggressively chose to protect a man who was actively destroying your entire life, and you deliberately tried to sacrifice my absolute freedom to do it. You completely alienated the only daughter who ever actually tried to genuinely save you. I am absolutely not your safety net ever again. I aggressively, firmly pressed the red button, completely ending the tragic phone call. I immediately opened my secure network settings and aggressively, permanently blocked her number from reaching my servers forever. I completely severed the final toxic root holding me to that deeply broken family tree. I stood up from my heavy leather chair and fiercely smoothed the sharp lapels of my impeccably tailored, pristine white designer suit. I aggressively walked out from behind my massive imported glass desk and stepped toward the wide floor-to-ceiling windows of my beautiful, expansive corner office. I had officially opened my own elite forensic accounting firm right in the incredibly wealthy heart of downtown Atlanta. My client list expanded rapidly, securing massive corporate contracts across the entire eastern seaboard. My professional reputation was absolutely impeccable. I was highly respected by top federal agencies, incredibly wealthy, and most importantly, I was completely undeniably free from the suffocating toxic shadows of my manipulative family. I looked out at the sprawling, beautiful Atlanta skyline, watching the bright afternoon sun aggressively reflect off the towering glass skyscrapers. I embodied absolute pure independence and immense untouchable power. I had walked straight through the dark, terrifying fires of betrayal and emerged completely forged in unbreakable steel. The scapegoat had completely legally destroyed the golden child, and I had built a massive, brilliant empire entirely with my own two hands. Have you ever aggressively had to actively walk completely away from toxic blood to violently find your absolute true worth? Let me actively know down in the comments below. Hit like and aggressively subscribe if you enjoyed this journey to justice, and share this story with anyone who desperately needs to firmly remember that their incredible absolute power always lies in their undeniable truth.